Hi, welcome to today's webcast, Hidden Risk Caused by Your SOC's Alert Prioritization, a primer for CIOs, produced by DeepSeas and CIO. I'm Sarah Kirk, Content Strategist for CIO Marketing Services. In today's presentation, CIOs and security leadership will gain specific operational insights on the inherent risks behind alert prioritization. We'll hear from David Lavinder, Deputy COO and Chief of Cyber Operations at DeepSeas. David brings extensive experience from his work leading threat intelligence missions, SOC operations, and almost a decade in the US intelligence community. Before we get started, I want to call your attention to the resources widget of your console where additional materials on today's topic from our sponsor DeepSeas can be found. Additionally, although today's webcast is on demand and we therefore cannot take live questions, you can submit questions to David and his team using the questions widget of your player, and you can expect to receive a response within just a few business days. And with that, I'm now very happy to welcome our guest, David Lavinder. David, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, share some insights with CIOs and their security leadership teams. A little bit about that hidden risk and the dreaded alert prioritization problem. So a little bit about me and why I'm sitting here talking to you today. So I originally am a graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. I did my first tour of duty doing research and development at the Air Force Research Labs. Got to touch a lot of different things, high performance computers, which is really just government speak for supercomputers, synthetic aperture radars, and multi-level security systems. That multi-level security systems piece is really what began kind of my interface with the Intel community, because some of the things I was working on needed to be red teamed by the Intel community red teams that are out there. Kind of from there, I got sucked into the Intel community, ended up getting stationed at Wright Pat Air Force Base in Ohio, where I worked at the National Air and Space Intelligence Center and created the first ever counter-space information warfare team. And essentially there, I was in charge of quantifying and qualifying the foreign threat, the information warfare threat to US space assets, meaning both the on-orbit assets and then the ground support systems as well. Eventually, I did move on to create the Air Force's only Service Intelligence Center mission that really merged Air Force requirements with NSA authorities to do what NSA does against really high priority Air Force requirements. After that, I moved to a cybersecurity company called Morphic, more in the private sector now, where I found myself surrounded by some of the best defenders on the planet. The heritage of Morphic was really impressive, to say the least, and defending, organizations against the opposing nations, best of the best. But I really quickly learned that defenders have a very different perspective of an attack than I do. And I was able to bring some kind of really interesting insights into kind of key kind of attacker SOPs. About 3 years later, Morphic was acquired by Booz Allen, where I led the operations of the managed threat services business. And what that means is it was kind of 3 or 4 things: the SOC operations themselves, the cyber threat intel operations, the detection operations, and then the security tool and engineering operations. And then recently, the managed threat services business was acquired and became DeepSeas. So let's dive right in. We're going to talk into the world of false positives and true positives, alert prioritization, alert fatigue, and some really common pitfalls we've seen. So to kind of set the stage here, right, we're going to be talking about a situation that involves an Excel document, right? And that's just going to be our use case we're going to walk through. And the situation we're going to be talking about is an Excel document that is talking to the internet, right? Now, there are both benign reasons why an Excel document could be talking to the internet and malicious reasons, right? And so on the benign example, maybe you have a spreadsheet that has mortgages in it and it's reaching out to the internet to pull the prime interest rate for the mortgage. That's a completely legit and benign reason why an Excel document would be reaching out to the internet. The converse of that would be something like a Trojanized Excel document where there's a malicious macro that's embedded and it's reaching out to the internet to pull down something like a stage 1 or a stage 2 payload. Another example is something like a shared infrastructure, right? You have badguy.com and mynewawesome.blog.com that happen to share the same hosting IP. So there are lots of situations where you have situations that could be benign, but also could be malicious. kind of depending on the situation. And in this perfect ideal world, right, a lot of alerts are generated with something that we call severities, right? Internally, we call those pain levels. And what you see in front of you is really the ideal state, right? Anything that represents a benign situation would have a pain level or severity of less than, in this case, 50. And anything that represents a degree of maliciousness would have a pain level or severity greater than 50, because that makes it really easy. So in that perfect scenario, what we can do then from a SOC operations perspective is say, in the SOC, we are going to ignore all alerts that are less than a severity of pain level 50. Or, conversely, we're going to triage every alert that has a severity of greater than 50. That way, we're not wasting any time on false positives and we're catching all the representative malicious artifacts. But we all know that's not really the world we live in. In reality, this is more of what we're looking at, right? There are messy curves, right? Now this, what you're looking in front of you is not representative of any actual data. They're just curves drawn on the screen here. But what you're looking at is a much more accurate representation. Right now, academically, the question becomes, where do we draw the line, right? Where are we going to draw that line of what the SOC actively triages and what they ignore because of the likelihood of it being a false positive? So for the calculus fans in the audience, right, academically, it would tell you to draw the line at where the two converge. And that's your biggest bang for your buck of what you're looking at and what you're not wasting your time on. And what that means is that essentially everything left of that intersection is now ignored alerts and everything right of that intersection is triaged. Now there's some implicit risks here, right? So you have that benign curve that starts at the low severity and kind of peters off at the higher severities. Those are representative of false positives. So now everything underneath that curve to the right are now essentially wasted time by the analysts. Conversely, on the other side, you have what's actual maliciousness that's being ignored by the SOC, and those represent what we call false negatives. So these false negatives and false positives are something that every SOC has to deal with in a very real operational way. And different security leaders take different approaches at how to do this. A common phrase that we hear a lot in our customers are security leaders saying something like, I don't want to miss anything, right? There's that risk of the false negatives that might go undetected. And so the security leader takes a hard stance and says, I don't want to miss anything. Now, functionally, that's easy to achieve, but operationally, it's very difficult to achieve. So functionally, all I have to do in the guidance of I don't want to miss anything is really slide that line down to the end of the true positive line, right? That line that represents maliciousness. But you can immediately see by doing that, I'm now increasing the number of false positives I'm letting into the system. And so I'm kind of inherently burdening the analysts with more false positives in the spirit of not missing anything. And the irony here is when you do that, that's when you start to hear analysts talk about alert fatigue. They're being overwhelmed with the number of alerts, and you're actually increasing your risk of missing something in an attempt to decrease your risk of missing something. Now, the converse of this argument is my analysts are drowning in false positives, and I want to increase my alerting to be high fidelity alerting, right? So functionally, then I can slide that little severity scale up to basically decrease my number of false positives. But there's implied risk here as well, is now I'm increasing the likelihood of a false negative occurring, which would be, representative of an alert that did trigger that now my SOC is just ignoring in the interest of time. So there's obvious risks there as well. Now, just to give an example of how we address this problem in DeepSeas, is we have essentially it's a balancing act that we're trying to achieve here, right? So academically, we know that where those two lines cross is kind of the calculus correct answer. What we do is we intentionally slide that a little bit to the left and willingly accept more false positives into the system to decrease the risk of false negatives. But we still have that little tail of false negatives that we need to be worried about. And we have something that we call control intelligence that we use to kind of downplay those risks a little bit. One good example, we have many examples, but one clean example there would be, say it's a Microsoft Office document comes through the detection apparatus. Let's sandbox those in order to really increase the likelihood of elevating that severity level in the event of it being malicious. And so that really kind of reduces a lot of the risk of those false negatives getting through the system. Now, one question I get asked a lot as I go through this is, we deal with Intel. I hear all these questions about Intel feeds and things like that, and I don't really understand how Intel affects my SOC operations. So as you look at the problem of Intel and the problem of tuning out signatures that are noisy or maybe increasing the fidelity of signatures, what you're really seeing is that kind of squishing effect. You're really trying to get those pain levels to be maximized, either benign events as close to 0 severity as possible, and malicious events as close to 100 as possible. So the act of tuning Intel and tuning those detection use cases and signatures really acts like a compressing force in the center of that equation there. The converse of this is when we accept new intelligence into the detection tools. Maybe you have an IOC feed from vendors that you just ingest. What that is doing is now increasing essentially pain levels and severities kind of across the board, because in a lot of times it's not very well vetted intelligence. It's not very well attributed to really actors or attacks or events. And so it really kind of muddies that water, and you see that those curves increase kind of along the entire spectrum. So every day when you're dealing with SOC operations, there's this kind of breathing that happens as you ingest new intel, you tune out noisy intel, right? You ingest more intel. There's really this breathing that happens with the alert, the volumes of alerts you experience kind of across that severity scale. So with all this now being said, what are we supposed to take away from this, right? So a lot of operations don't even recognize that this decision was made at some point. Sometimes security leaders will dictate a decision, and the SOC itself doesn't have a choice. But more often than not, what we find, when we talk to customers, is that there's a decision that's been made, but it was made so long ago that nobody remembers how the decision was made or what some of the implied risks are here. And so common phrases to look out for when you're talking to SOC leadership or SOC analysts are things like, there are so many alerts. We only have time to focus on the high risk ones. We are constantly battling alert prioritization, right? You're looking for those key phrases like alert fatigue. And really what to understand here is there is a balance that must be achieved, right? And putting onuses on the security team, like I don't want to miss anything, or I only want high fidelity alerts, is ripe with risk that a lot of security leaders don't understand. One of my favorite conversations to have with customers is when they come to us and say, we would like to manage you, or help you manage the false positives that we're dealing with. And I always kind of joke, because if it becomes very, very easy, if all the security leadership is looking for is reduced false positives, it becomes very, very easy to achieve that, right? Just by sliding that line in the scale to the right. But that's not really what the security leader is after, because just by sliding that line, we're now increasing the risk of false negatives, right? And so this is something that a lot of security leaders kind of find themselves in the situation of. They haven't really thought about how they ended up in this situation, or haven't really thought through kind of the deliberate act of making this decision. And the best advice I can give is that which is measured performs. So that wraps up my part of the discussion. Thank you, Sarah. Back to you.
Thanks for that, David. Now, you've shared with us some common questions that you often receive when presenting this type of information. Let's dive into a few of them now. So our first question is, how do I tell what's happening in my SOC?
So this is a question we get all the time from customers. And really the best advice I can give is you want to ask guided questions, right? Questions like, how many alerts do we get a day, a week, a month, right? How do we prioritize what we look at? You're looking for those key indicators of alert fatigue, where if a number of alerts you get in 1 week far exceeds what your analyst could possibly do based on the number of SOC analysts that you have. Those key indicators are really what you're looking for as kind of intention objects, right? You're looking for that guided kind of answer of, we're actually prioritizing alerts far more aggressively, and we need to kind of peel that onion a little bit and make sure we're making deliberate decisions about that prioritization.
Great. Next, my SOC tells me there are more alerts than they can possibly review. What do I do?
So this is a common problem that security leaders find themselves in, right? And this is kind of an interesting discussion because if you think about the problem of cybersecurity from a technology vendor's perspective, it looks very different than from a services or from an internal SOC perspective. Just, kind of focusing on that for just a minute. If I'm a technology provider in the cybersecurity space, I possess a big risk that some event will occur that my technology didn't catch. That puts me kind of at the forefront of some liability problems, of some very challenging questions being asked by my customers. And so from a technology perspective, it almost makes a lot of sense for me to alert on a lot of different things, regardless of what that means from an alert fatigue perspective to the SOC, because that gives me essentially plausible deniability, right? I can just send the alerts and I can say, look, it wasn't my problem. It wasn't my fault that you didn't get to analyze them all. I triggered the alert on the malicious behavior. So that's a really big problem. And it drives this kind of problem of alert fatigue into SOCs. And one of my colleagues has an extremely relevant opinion here, is basically they said, an alert that goes unactioned shouldn't be an alert at all. And that's something that we take very seriously at DeepSeas, because if we are completely overwhelmed with alerts, and there are entire swaths of alerts that aren't going actioned, we have a problem, right? And requisite, right? An analogy to the SOC here has a problem as well. You have to have some ability to control that outcome. And how we deal with that at DeepSeas is we really look for technologies where we can control that outcome, right? That we look for tools where we can adapt what they're detecting, where we have some say into the alerts that those are generating. And that's kind of a non-negotiable for us, and it shouldn't be for SOCs either, is if you can't control what the tools are detecting and augment them to make them better, or in some cases, quiet down the noise, right? That should be a non-negotiable. I always joke that I can't have my analysts sitting downstream of somebody else's crappy detections. And this is exactly why, right? We're trying desperately to avoid that huge problem that alert fatigue causes.
Okay, great. And for our final question, how do you ensure high fidelity detections from Intel feeds?
Yeah, so Intel feeds are an interesting problem as well, right? Because Intel feeds, a lot of customers will judge Intel feeds, not necessarily by the quality of the Intel, which is very hard to judge, but something by the quantity of the Intel, which is very easy to measure, right? And so what this causes is kind of this reliance on, I need more, I need to collect everything I can to be successful in this fight against the attackers. The most important thing to understand here and realize is that most Intel feeds give you little more than indicators of compromise. And most indicators of compromise have a useful shelf life measured on days, maybe weeks or months. And so my best advice here on high fidelity detections from your Intel feeds are look for those feeds that offer opportunities beyond IOCs that you can feed into your tool sets. Maybe they're snort rules or suricata rules, bro rules, right? Or Zeek, Yara rules, right? Things like that tend to have a much longer shelf life and are very easy to tune. Whereas IOCs, it either exists and is there or is worthless and is generating noise.
Great. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions for us, David. And thank you so much for being here with us today. You've certainly given us and our audience a lot to think about.
Happy to be here. Thank you for the time.
Great. Well, that concludes today's webcast, Hidden Risk Caused by Your SOC's Alert Prioritization, a Primer for CIOs, produced by DeepSeas and CIO, presented by David Lavinder, Deputy COO and Chief Cyber Operations at DeepSeas. A reminder once again to our audience that you may submit questions to David and his team using the Q&A widget in your player, and you'll also find additional materials from DeepSeas in the resources section. We appreciate you being here with us today. For CIO and DeepSeas, I'm Sarah Kirk. Thanks so much for joining us.